Communicating spiritually to dead dogs for seeking political advice might sound like an utterly bizarre idea, but Argentina's fate hinges on these very canines as Javier Milei, the psychic dead dog communicator, emerges as the biggest winner in Argentina's primary elections. He taught economics and authored several books. In fact, he was a rock singer, and his band named Everest mainly covered Rolling Stone songs. He says it's super easy to dollarize Argentina. This would end the fraud of the peso. He believes that Argentina's central bank is the worst garbage that exists on this earth. He has some interesting takes about a whole lot of things. While global leaders, scientists and businessmen are breaking their heads over finding solutions for climate change, he dismisses it as just another socialist agenda. According to him, abortion is also a much darker side of the same agenda. Continuing the series of explosive comments, he recently denounced Pope Francis as an imbecile and representative of evil. He calls China an assassin. In a recent interview, he said that he doesn't cut deals with communists.
Welcome back to Why Are We Like This, the podcast that treats Florida like the active crime scene it is. My name, David Quinones. I am your host. As usual, I am joined by my co-host, Tomas Kennedy. Hello, Tomas.
Hey, how are you? Trying to get in touch with my roots here with this podcast today.
This episode's going to be a good one. Yeah. A very Tomas is right in his wheelhouse. And of course, if Tomas is here, that means that I am also joined by my co-host, Gerald Doherty. Hello, Gerald.
Hello. How are you?
Good. Fresh back from Sin City.
Yes, won't discuss. Yeah. But I didn't do any sins.
It's supposed to stay
I was
there.
A good boy. Yes.
So we've got a great episode lined up today. There are a few new developments in the shady, bankrupt world of Florida property insurance, and we're going to be joined by Lawrence Maurer from the Tampa Bay Times, who's going to talk all about that with us. But first, we want to welcome Hernan Reyes, public opinion analyst in Buenos Aires, who's here to talk to us a little bit about he and Tomas's shared homeland and its current chaotic, less than perfect political situation. For our first, welcome Hernan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for calling me.
For our first topic, we are heading a continent away to the country that gave us my least favorite Spanish accent and my favorite foreign-born podcast co-host, Tomas. Tomas's homeland, Argentina, which is facing a crucial upcoming presidential election on November 19th. This will be the second round of elections and will determine the country's president. For the Peronist Party, Sergio Massa, Argentina's center-left economy minister, who has overseen an economy that has a nearly 140% annual inflation right now. His opponent is somebody you've probably heard a lot about in U.S. media, Javier Milei, a radical right-wing libertarian who draws comparisons to Donald Trump and who has hopes to become the first ever elected world leader, who is also surrounded by a phalanx of cloned bull mastiffs, which is a real thing. I did not make that up. That's actually true. So things are going great. In the recent first round election, Milei came in second to Massa, but neither had enough vote to avoid a runoff. Yesterday came news that the now eliminated candidate, Patricia Bullrich from the center-right coalition of parties, has endorsed Milei, despite his accusation that she blew up kindergartens as a young leftist guerrilla. So for some context, Florida, there's a Florida peg, guys. We have about 30% of the U.S. Argentine population, 57,260, I guess 57,259 now that Tomas is gone and left us to go to New York. Tomas, Hernan, what's going on in Argentina? Tomas, you very recently wrote about this, so I'll let you sort of lead us into this topic in a much more knowledgeable way than I can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to let Hernan speak at it more in length, but basically, after years of discontent due to an imploding economy that, in my opinion, was triggered and caused by the government of Mauricio Macri in the mid-2010s, the IMF loan that they acquired, the biggest IMF loan in human history that we are now on the hook for, and the neoliberal business-friendly policies that they enacted. Basically, the chickens are coming home to roost, and the current government hasn't been able to stabilize the ship due to, COVID and other things getting in the way. So, we have a lot of the population that's basically trying to throw a grenade at the system, and we're in the danger of supporting this guy, Javier Milei, who, wants to revert back to a lot of the policies of the 90s of the Carlos Menem presidency. He says that was the best presidency that in Argentina's history. And this is a guy that at the time pegged the value of the peso to the dollar, right? Basically, that left us vulnerable to market pressures from other countries. And in the mid 90s, because of economic crises in Asia, in Mexico, and in other areas of the world that impacted the economy of Argentina, ultimately resulting in a massive bank run in the late 90s and an economic implosion that led to an exodus of Argentina fleeing from the country, including myself. So Javier Milei looks at this, what happened in the 90s, and he says, not only do I want to go back to that, I want to go further. So his main promise is basically that he is going to dollarize Argentina's economy, right? And he wants to do that without having sufficient dollar reserves in order to undertake that, right? So, I'll leave it at that, Hernan. I'm curious about your opinion, but, it's just a really insane presidency that's proposing things that are not just unfeasible, but if they are somehow feasible, they're going to end in, hardship and a rethread of the past for Argentinians.
Well, what Tomas says, he points out, is absolutely right. However, what I must add is that Javier Milei's support does not come from his proposals. What I'm trying to say is he finds support basically from his charisma and his positioning as an outsider. Let's remember that Argentina, until 1983, has undergone constant interruptions to its democracy, and so it's had uninterrupted democracy since 1983, and since then the economy has been really on a down spiral. So we have a bipartisan system, much more like in the United States, where you had Democrats and Republicans. Here we had Peronists and the US UCR until 2001, when the whole system collapsed, and it turned into a two-coalition system. And these two coalitions had both their turn to govern Argentina, and both of them basically had increased poverty. So in 1976, Argentina had the same degree of inequality, which is measured in the Gini coefficient, as France. And now we have the same basically inequality as Peru. So the social degradation of our society has created a society that's very frustrated with democracy and what democracy has promised them. So in technical terms, democracy functions very well. People go, they vote, there's no fraud. However, in terms of its delivery, the political system has failed to deliver to the people what the basics, an economy that mostly works, that's predictable, that makes it's very. I think that there are two feelings that coexist now. One, the need for change, and the other one, the need for stability. And both of these feelings are which basically what we are going to vote for in the next election. So Tomas is completely right about Milei, but his show politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's all it's a candidate that comes from television, from social media. It's basically TikTok one in that respect, right?
Gerald, this sounds very familiar.
No real profound debates.
Sounds very familiar. I understand now. I realize that over the course of the last 7 years, whenever somebody bombastic would come onto any international political scene, everybody would say, "Oh, he's Brazil's Donald Trump. He is Mexico's Donald Trump." But the comparisons seem very apt in this case. That this is a guy who has seemingly come out of nowhere. For those of us who casually follow international politics, this was not a name that I had in my head a year ago. Why is that? Where did he come from, and why is that ascent apparently seem to be so quick? Is it just like media, or like what's the cause of it?
Well, he's very charismatic. He's some people call him like a rock star because his hairstyle. He's very he's very politically incorrect, and so the youth, basically, which is the where he derives most of his support, take him as a rebel. So he has positioned himself as a rebel in terms of political ideology. So and the youth, they don't know what happened in 1990s. They don't know what happened in 2001 when the government collapsed. They just see this rock star that wants to break everything up, and they kind of relate to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I actually titled my article "Argentina's on the verge of electing its own Donald Trump," and I kind of did that for the clickbait and to sort of like build a relationship with the American viewer, right?
Yeah.
But I actually think he's very different from Donald Trump in a way that Donald Trump doesn't really have an ideology, right? I mean, he's obviously like a fascist and a grifter, but I don't think he's like academically has an ideology. I think Javier Milei, even though I think a lot of, he has plagiarized a lot of his work, and I think, his economic theory is really poor, and he just kind of like says things, really fast and loudly, and just kind of runs over opponents and is very incorrect. He does have an ideology, right, Hernan? I mean, he's a very strict anarcho-capitalist, libertarian. I mean, he says crazy things like, he was being interviewed and he said, "When I am president, we are going to cut trade relations with Brazil and China because they're communist. And I, in principle, will not trade with communists." Now, this is significant because Brazil and China are Argentina's biggest trading partners. They're our biggest socioeconomic partners. So it would be a fucking disaster to cut relationships with them. He says that he would remove Argentina from Mercosur, which is sort of like a free trade agreement in South America that allows for like an economic understanding between these countries that have relatively similar wealth. It would be, there's legitimate criticism there, but it would be disastrous to just pull Argentina out of that. It would really leave us at a disadvantage. He says that he'll just pull us out because Mercosur is a taxing entity, and he is fundamentally opposed to taxes. You don't see Trump saying things like that, right? That he's like, well, I'm ideologically opposed to taxes because of my libertarianism. And it's just, so it's very bizarre individual. And like Hernan said, I don't think that like a majority of Argentinians just woke up one day and they're like, we're anarcho-capitalist libertarians, right? They're just fucking angry at the system. And this guy says, fuck the politicians, and a lot of people feel they identify with that.
It's more of a Pepe thing. There's not really a ideology. It's more just like, fuck that.
We have a very, very similar divide like you have in the United States, where you have Democrats proposing more government spending and Republicans always proposing tax cuts. And here we also have a similar divide in terms of, and so Milei is going all about government cutting on government spending, and we have a very, very strong welfare system in Argentina. University is free, the healthcare is free, and so for us that it's very, very part of our identity, and so I think at the end people realized that all these acquired rights, social rights, were in danger, and I think that's what's at stake now.
I was just going to say, listening to Tomas talk about Milei's program, his ideas are even worse when you combine them together. Because one of the things I learned about reading in your article, Tomas, is that pegging the peso to the dollar made it very hard to pivot to within negative external shocks to the economy. I can't think of anything that would produce a bigger negative external shock to the economy than amputating trade relations with your number one and number two trading partner just because you don't like the cut of their political jib anymore. But also in your article, I was struck by the hyperinflate, like the 114, I think, percent inflation rate. Just a hypothetical question. Do you think the attraction to dollarizing the economy is just as simple as, if you've lost faith in the peso, let's just replace the peso, which I understand to someone who's young might sound, it sounds like a solution to a problem if you don't think about it for longer than like 2 seconds.
Well, our mindset is very dollarized. Historically, we save in dollars, we think in dollars, we buy houses in dollars. We're always, since we're kids, we are following what's the value of the dollar, which changes every day. So Argentina, and also the lack of dollars is one of the most important economic restriction we usually have. And so we have, and this is because we have a very complex dilemma between help me out here, Tomas, but the farming part of the country, the exporting
agricultural,
which they want the dollar to be high and the peso to be low because it's for their advantage, and the industrial sector that wants a dollar at a low value because they need to buy machinery and so forth, and so they need a dollar to be low. So the dollar has always been important to us, and in this moment where the peso has lost so much value, for most people who don't understand what it means in terms of loss of sovereignty, they feel it's a very drastic and possible solution.
Yeah, I want to add something, Gerald, about what you said in terms of the cutting of relations between our two biggest trading partners. So Hernan talked about it briefly, that we've had democracy in Argentina since 1983. From the mid 70s to the early 1980s, we had this military dictatorship that was brutal. They disappeared over 30,000 people accused of having communist sympathies, including family members of mine. And it's a real stain in our legacy. Milei's vice president, and Milei himself to a degree, is very apologist of this era, and they actually deny the well-documented fact that over 30,000 people were disappeared. But just to highlight how extreme this cutting of relations proposal is with China and Brazil, at the time, Videla, who was the first leader of the military junta that led Argentina, they were strict anti-communists. I mean, if you were a communist in Argentina at the time, you're in a real risk of being murdered, as I told you. Argentina actually had excellent relationships with the Soviet Union at the time. And that was because, they prioritized the diplomacy and economic stability. And they were not communist sympathizers by any means, as I told you. But we've gone to a place where the military junta at the time would be willing to trade with communists in that era to a fucking maniac that's just saying, well, me personally, I don't agree with these people, so therefore the state machinery is going to cut relationships with Brazil, who's our neighbor next door. It's absolute insanity. Hernan, I wanted to ask, because you talk about this sort of bipartisan dynamic that we have in our in Argentinian politics, and we're living in a weird moment, right, where I kind of in a way see it as what Bolsonaro did in Brazil, that he sort of imploded the traditional Brazilian right, when he came into office, kind of absorbed some of these former traditional right-wing elements. There was a small right-wing opposition to Bolsonaro that eventually ditched him. What do you think is going to happen to the Juntos por el Cambio coalition, which is the center-right coalition that you initially talked about, has been traditionally there for the last 20 years? Because their candidate is out of the runoff, right? I mean, what's going to happen with that? And how is the right wing going to reorganize themselves? You know, are we going to have this bipartisan dynamic or not?
Well, that's a mystery. I wish I knew I could answer that question for you, Tomas. But we're in the middle of that process, and I think the UCR, La UCR, what we call it here, which is mostly a centrist political party that has always been the opposition to the Peronist party, has an opportunity now to rebuild its identity. Because what we have here is that the main political coalitions, I think what Milei is forcing them to do is also to renovate not only their discourses, which are all in both cases antiquated, because as much as I tend to agree more with the Peronist party, their ideas which are anchored in Perón, which was at the government in the 1940s, are very, very antiquated in today's technologically driven economy. And so I think what Milei is forcing them to do is also it's a renovation of both coalitions, and I really don't know how this is going to end. If Peronism wins, it probably won't have as much pressure to do this, but the UCR, which is a part of Juntos por el Cambio, has now a chance to become more independent and go back to its roots.
And how do you see the election shaping up on November 19th, right? I mean, so you had Patricia Bullrich endorse Milei. You have a huge segment of the population, about 50-something, voting for right-wing candidates, and about 30-something, you know, maybe 40 with Bregman and Ciaretti voting for Massa. Do you think that it's possible for Massa to overcome and win this runoff?
I think it is possible, basically because Massa has positioned himself as a centrist. So he's in the middle of the ideological spectrum right now. He's someone that's prone to dialogue with the other parties, and Argentina needs to have dialogue with the other parties in order to build long-term policies. And Milei, he has positioned himself at the far right. So now he has to go for the independent voters, and he's forced to move to the center, and that's much more difficult for him because he has gone to such an extreme that he's going to lose identity if he changes too much in the next few weeks. So now he's showing himself as very desperate to go for all the votes he can. He even offered the leftist party seat in the government, which they laughed at, fortunately.
You're talking about medium Bregman's folks?
Yes.
I didn't even know that.
So can I ask a question that kind of ties two things together that I noticed when I was researching for this episode? One of them is a lot of the social media discourse in Spanish, apparently in the country, seems to suggest that these are just people, and again, on Twitter and on social media, and obviously they might be full of shit, as we say here in the United States. But a lot of them seem to be saying, when they looked at the first round voting, not to look at voting for the candidate individually, but rather that all of the votes that were for Bullrich and for Milei were against the Peronist party. This is a vote against the status quo. And so these people, again, seem to be very, I guess, certain that those votes will translate over to Milei. But I was reading about this Bullrich person, the Bullrich, the political entity, and I was reading about her background, and she seemed to be a firebrand leftist, Juventud Peronista, like back in the 70s, and she I just wonder, like, again, you don't know a country as well as the people that are from it and who have lived through it. What was the dynamic that took people like that and kind of put them against that status quo? I mean, I know you were talking about the inflation and the unpredictable economics, but I was really struck by the fact that the person who came in third is now sitting on this at the top of the center-right coalition. And when you read about her in her youth, she was a fiery leftist who spent time as a political prisoner. Is that a common arc over the last 50 years in Argentina, that people have like moved in that direction, and why?
Well, I don't think it's that common for people to make such drastic changes. We do have a lot of politicians that change parties and go from one to the other, and because also. Political identities have, like I said, in 2001, the main political parties basically exploded, and they had to like reconfigure themselves, and they reconfigure themselves by making coalitions. But those coalitions don't have very clear identities, and so the Juntos por el Cambio, which is the coalition to which Bullrich belongs, has an identity that's basically we're anti-Peronism. They don't have many ideas in common. They don't have a platform, a program that's concrete, that's easy to understand, and so their identity has been basically not only anti-Peronist, but more precisely anti-Kirchnerista. Anti-Kirchner, which Kirchner. Let's remind the audience that Nestor Kirchner and then Cristina Kirchner, they governed Argentina from 2003 to 2015. And so they had.
And Cristina is still the sitting vice president at this moment, right?
Yes, and she has a very strong leadership, and so when they ran against her in 2015, their positioning was basically we are against her. And so the main mistake that they have done in this election was that they repeated the same the same strategy, and today that's not what's at stake. It's not at stake right now to end Kirchnerism, and that's what their proposal is basically. We are going to finish. We are going to terminate with Kirchnerism, which is the same thing as we're going to terminate Peronism.
Yeah, and just to highlight the absurdity of Argentinian politics, Hernan, I don't know if you'll agree with me, kind of answering your question, David. So Carlos Menem, who we talked about earlier, right? This neoliberal president in the 90s that did the conversion plan, pegging the peso to the dollar. Milei says that he was the best president Argentina has ever had. He was actually a Peronist. He was actually a Peronist that came up in the 70s and 80s as a not as militant as Patricia Bullrich, but he came in through the left faction of the party, was pro-social welfare, was a traditional Peronist. He would actually wear his sideburns sort of like coming out from the side of his face in like a kind of twist, similar to the traditional caudillos that fought the Unitarian Wars in the late 1800s in Argentina as a populist throwback. As soon as he gets elected in the early 1990s, cuts off the little things and the sideburns, starts wearing like a fancy suit, and becomes part of what we call the Washington consensus, right? The Chicago Boys, the Milton Friedman school of thought, shock doctrine. And yeah, you have a lot of that, right? And in Argentina, where people are just wildly just kind of like swinging and making coalitions and ditching their like political persona and adopting another one. And Peronismo has been very fluid throughout its history, but I think ultimately its political base, it's center left, pro union, pro worker, kind of like social democrat, and I think it has a much more like sort of like a foundation than like the Juntos por el Cambio folks who, like, I agree with you, Hernan, they're just anti-Kirchnerism hysteria.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, Peronism has basically three main ideas one is social justice, the other one is economic independence, and political sovereignty. Those are the three pillars of Peronism. And so even though we've had presidents like Menem who had not followed those three ideas, those three ideas basically guide the discourse and most political policies when Peronists are in power. And so that makes it much stronger in terms of identity, and that explains why Massa has that 35% of the vote in the general election, because it's a very solid part of the population, segment of the population.
Yeah, it's very odd to see. The thing that stuck out to me is like it's very not common. I think, right, Gerald? You can keep me honest on this, but like you don't see a U.S. aligned country have an assassination attempt on a leader or former leader very often. Yeah. It doesn't happen a little bit more frequently these days, but just last September, Cristina Fernandez there was an attempt on her life. That was captured on video, and I just, whenever you see something like that, you wonder like what is going on, what is the undercurrent of the the political sentiment in the place, because usually it's not good, for it to get to that point.
Yeah, and it's incredible that event, which is so serious and so grave, has not created much more indignation from the Argentinian people.
Well,
right?
was that a situation where because I can imagine that happening here in the U.S. and immediately there would be calls for denunciations on both sides of the aisle, and was that a politicized event in Argentina? Because I think mostly here in the U.S. the media we consumed was just the chaos of it, the moment, the video, right, and we didn't really, the pomp and the circumstance of it. We never heard any follow up. So were that didn't really have political ramifications? Is that the case?
Yeah, it didn't have political ramifications, and like I said, it's very. We have the Argentine society is divided much more like the American society is divided into Trump haters and Trump supporters, and in this issue, it should have all been united, right? Because it's very grave. However, the part of the population that hates Cristina, they just dismiss this as just one crazy guy that tried to kill her.
It's a really, really scary time for our country. I voted last week. I'm going to be voting again on November 19 for Sergio Massa. And yeah, we're going to be doing poll watching with my mom actually in Miami.
Cool.
This is how great. I mean, Hernan, we were talking about it on via WhatsApp. This is how right wing I am. So yeah, hoping for the best, man. I'm really, really worried about our country.
Well, with that said, we'll wrap it up. I want to thank very much for the informative stuff that you never have the context to talk about this stuff if it's not like in your backyard sometimes. And we really appreciate, Hernan, you coming on and sharing your analysis with us. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Our next guest is Lawrence Maurer, a reporter covering the Capitol for the Tampa Bay Times, Miami Herald Tallahassee Bureau. You can follow him on Twitter at LMaurer3. That's MOWER 3. Lawrence, welcome to Why We Like This.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, because you spent the first few weeks of your October reporting on this property insurance crisis, and that's been, ever present in Florida for several years now, and it's something that we've been talking about a lot on this show. It was actually the subject, guys. It was the subject of our first episode, wasn't it? Like we talked about it in our very first episode.
Yeah, it's been on our minds for a little while.
On your guys' mind and in my fucking life with like dealing with with
my running gag of the show. David struggles with property insurance.
Yeah.
to try to
man.
get this house insured.
What are you paying? Who do you have?
I have Citizens. I got dumped into Citizens. I'll rehash it for your benefit, Lawrence, and for the benefit of the listeners. I went through the entire force-placed rigmarole where I was on some quasi, like the insurance that cannot be named. Apparently, it was like this like weird J.P. Morgan Chase solution that they shovel you into because there was literally, which I'm sure you've learned in your reporting. There were just no options. There was just nobody that would insure a 90-year-old Coral Gables bungalow in 2022. So like it just wasn't happening. Like and I'm far from alone. There's tens of thousands of people that are currently in that position. I, through a very weird quirk of the lack of oversight of Citizens Insurance and the way that they're able to just, as a quasi public entity, just make their own rules and promulgate whatever they want. I was kind of locked out, and I couldn't even get insurance from them, and I had to wait several months until it had been 36 months since my oldest claim. So I had to wait to time out. Basically, it was one of these very arcane, ridiculous things.
Well, do you want something to make you feel maybe a little bit better?
Please, I'll never say no to that.
Yeah, I found out who apparently has the most expensive Citizens policy in the whole state. And this is from Senator Jason Pizzo. He had it. He was paying $35,000. That was his premium, annual premium for a condo policy.
My premium is whatever. I'll throw it out there. I don't care. I'm all about transparency. My premium is about $8,000 a year. Yeah. So
yeah, I'm in Tallahassee. I've got a 1945 home, and that's big single story, and it's 2,200. And it's gone up, but I really can't complain. I really can't.
Tomas, you've been in my house. I don't think you could describe it as a mansion or anything like enormous. I don't have like I'm not running like a jet propulsion laboratory out of the back or anything
but
like
it's
that.
small. It's nice. The neighborhood's nice, but
it's quaint.
It's not.
It's a polite house.
Yes. So look, here's a couple of the for the benefit of our listeners. If you want to go back and listen and read some of Lawrence's reporting over the beginning of the month, a couple of headlines that grabbed our attention. One from October 10th: Florida insurance premiums might not go down, industry says. And then a week and 2 days later, you were writing a second article. Florida leaders blame insurance crisis on lawsuits, but evidence is thin. Go support local journalism. Subscribe to the Tampa Bay Times or the Miami Herald. What really caught my attention was your most recent article, because it really felt like someone took the words right out of my brain that I had been thinking for a long time. Last year, we had heard about all we would hear from the insurance companies was how they would just love to be doing business here in Florida. They want to stay here, but it's just too many lawsuits. The lawsuits had become endemic, which always felt to us kind of suspect, because the main reason people sue is because why? Their claims are denied. And if that's the case, aren't you actually saying that the denials are endemic? And this is like a brain worm that I'd had, Lawrence, for the last year. Yeah. And so what did your reporting find when you dug into this?
Yeah, I've been hearing this too for years. I've been in Tallahassee since 2018 or late 2017. And insurance is one of my beats. And I've heard the same thing, that, it's lawsuits. This is the problem. And, there are a lot of lawsuits. The statistic you hear thrown around for years and years now is that Florida makes up somewhere between 6 and 10% of the nation's claims, but something like between 65 and 80% of all of the lawsuits, which is a surprising statistic. I mean, that does sound like a lot. And there's anecdotal evidence of, that some lawyers have behaved poorly, and done stuff that's like certainly unethical and if not illegal with some of these claims. But, my thing was, we're 5 years now into this crisis. And, the fact that there's a lot of lawsuits is not proof that lawsuits are what is driving up the premiums and causing companies to go out of business. And so I just started asking anyone I could find, like, give me your best case for why lawsuits are driving up rates, and why, like, how many of these lawsuits are actually frivolous, and, give me evidence that they're causing these companies to go out of business. Well, I know that they're not causing companies to go out of business because the state's own reports, the state does insolvency reports after each company goes under. It's required under state law, and crazily, nobody knew. I couldn't find anyone who really knew these reports existed until I wrote about it last year. And they changed the law to kind of speed some of these things up. But none of these reports mention lawsuits, okay, which is pretty weird. So I'm like, okay, well, are they driving up rates? And there's no evidence that the state has not produced any kind of studies or reports or anything like that. They can't say definitively rates went up by X percent, X percent because of these numbers of lawsuits or these frivolous lawsuits. They haven't studied how many of these lawsuits are actually frivolous.
Right.
And so when you kind of take a step back, you say, okay, well, there are a lot of lawsuits, and it seems very unusual compared to other states that we have this many lawsuits. But Florida's insurance market is very unusual in many ways. It's unusual in that we make up a huge outsized percentage of complaints against insurance companies. There was the American Policyholder Association did a study of federal data that showed that the top 15 insurers make up, like 6% of the nation's premiums, but more than 50% of the nation's complaints.
Yeah.
Well, if you have a lot of complaints, you're going to have a lot of you're going to have a lot of lawsuits. On top of this, the Insurance Consumer Advocate did a study of this back in 2020. She surveyed 7,000 policyholders.
Tanisha Brown, I believe, or Carter. Tanisha
Yeah.
Carter. Yeah.
Yeah, Tasha Carter.
Tasha Carter. Yes.
Yeah, and she reports to the CFO, Jimmy Petronas. She's an appointee, but she did a survey.
Who's fighting wokeism? In the
That's probably the reason.
Yeah,
Tomas got a little smile on his face when he heard Jimmy Petronas.
I thought so. Wokeism has not been cited for an insurance company failure either.
Not yet.
Spoiler alert.
But she surveyed all 7,000 policyholders, and these policyholders, 78% of them said that they that they hired a lawyer because they had a bad claims experience. Their claim was either delayed or denied, or they didn't get paid enough. And she told the House committee in 2021 that these things trigger litigation. Okay, so basically what we're looking at is a situation where, yes, we have a lot of lawsuits, and lawsuits probably are having some effect on rates. Some effect.
You talk about in the article about the sort of the dynamic behind that, where another unique part of Florida, the way that Florida insurers operate, is that they're not as big. They're actually smaller companies. You're not talking about your State Farms or your Progressives or these huge companies. And what they will do is help keep me honest here. I don't want to make a mistake. Yeah. They will outsource the key parts of the claims process. And just like you would think, when outsourcing something sensitive and important like that, it gets screwed up and it ends up being a default no. Like a lot of times it'll just be like a rubber stamped letter or a rubber stamp response no to almost any claim, and then that tends to exacerbate the problem. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's primarily an issue after storms. I mean, but you're getting to really kind of the heart of the issue, which is that Florida's market is unusual in a really big way, in that in most states, the insurance market is like 80% the insurance giants that you see advertised on TV, like the ostrich and the emu and all the other animals. And 20% the small companies, domestic companies you might not have heard of before. Well, in Florida, that's flipped. It's been flipped basically since Hurricane Andrew, where you have 80% of the market of these little companies that most people have never heard of, and 20% of the big guys. Now, that's in itself is not unusual, but what Florida does is it with these little companies set up sister companies and parent companies, okay? And those companies charge the insurance company for fees, usually $25 per policy, and something of like up to 30%, sometimes even more than 30% of all the premium dollars. So if you have $1,000 you're paying in premium, 30% potentially is going to a sister company. Now, why do they do this? They do this because insurance companies' profits are capped by regulators, at usually around 4% or so. But affiliate companies are not capped. They're not. So how do you get the money out of the insurance company that can go to dividends, to shareholders, to buybacks, to bonuses, to executives, to all this stuff? You take it, the sister company takes it out, okay, like at 30% of the premium. And when the insurance company has a hard time, the insurance company can, they are affiliated with the sister company. The insurance company can go to the affiliate for more money, and sometimes you do see that happen. But when the insurance company goes belly up, the insurance company is on the hook. The sister company is not.
Is off the hook, yeah.
Exactly.
This is like a way of limiting liability. This is like a lot of when the difference between filing for a new LLC versus like doing business as another company.
Exactly.
A lot of times you'll shell yourself out, and then that way. But that kind of gets to the crux that I want to ask you about, because I want to finish this when we finish talking. I want to end on whether or not we can, whether or not this is the right model, whether or not insurance even makes sense as a business model. But before we get to that, Tomas, can you set us up a little bit with what happened in the 2022 special session? And I think Lawrence would probably be able to follow up with what's happened in the intervening year, whether or not that special session solved everything and made everything better.
Yeah, I literally was about to ask that. So we're reading each other's minds. I mean, look, I don't work in the special sessions. I work in immigration issues, professionally or whatever. So I'm not in the weeds of what happened in those special sessions. But I believe, Lawrence, there were two special sessions called in recent years to deal with this issue. And what basically happened, it resulted in a $2 billion taxpayer funded bailout for these insurance companies to basically prop them up. And then, of course, it's the lawsuit reform that they passed recently to take care of these so-called frivolous lawsuits that, in my opinion, because I'm seeing your tweet right now, Lawrence, you say what are factors of insolvencies, according to the report, are improper management, improper transactions with affiliates or subsidiaries, which we've gone over, and natural disasters. So when you have this mix of both improper management and natural disasters putting so much pressure into the property insurance market, of course you're going to have a lot of lawsuits because people are fucking pissed off about their claims not being paid and about the company being mismanaged. So in my opinion, I don't have any hard data, but that's what's driving up the lawsuits. But going back to what you asked, David, yeah, they basically gave a bailout to these insurance companies without any sort of as I understand it, meaningful regulation or reform of the market in Florida.
Lest anybody think that we're just being some wingnut lefties calling it. Left wing icon Donald Trump called it a bailout as well, as Lawrence mentioned in his report.
No, you're right. And so the $2 billion you mentioned was actually $3 billion, and they didn't necessarily go to insurance companies. What basically it was doing was offering reinsurance to some of these companies, and hardly anyone used it because that was a savings that was supposed to be passed on to consumers. If you tapped into that program, you had to pass the money on to consumers, and of course hardly anyone tapped into it. They didn't need it, but basically these little companies are highly dependent on reinsurance. So basically they are paying for insurance to pay out storm claims. So if you're an insurance company, you're paying your insurance company to insure your house. The insurance company buys insurance for itself to pay your claim if your home is damaged by a storm. And basically these companies are extremely vulnerable to whims in this reinsurance market, which is completely unregulated. And these companies are global. A lot of them are in Bermuda. A lot of them are in Europe. They're unregulated, and the rates have gone way up, way more than, I talked to an insurance executive. He estimated that litigated claims, claims where there's a lawyer on it are about 20% of every premium dollar, well, where reinsurance is between 30 and 40%. And really, reinsurance for a lot of these companies is closer to 50% of every premium dollar. So when reinsurance rates go up, that really hurts them. It hurts them way more than litigation does. But you haven't heard any kind of talk about, what to do about reinsurance, really. Like, this is kind of, everybody's just kind of throwing their hands up.
But that's like a backstop, really. I mean, that's the foundation that if you're going to pursue a insurance scheme as your way of, look, things are going to get knocked down, things are going to break, we're going to get a million storms. If our solution for it is a free market of insurance, then there has to be a backstop like that. And at some point, you also have to wonder: as a private sector venture, is it profitable enough to satisfy the investors and the people who are behind it? Is the mission of indemnifying property in the peninsula of Florida a profitable venture or not?
Well, that's the question. Under this affiliate structure, it's highly profitable. I've actually got a story coming out. Maybe tomorrow, that gets into details about one of these startup companies, and that they're highly profitable. They're advertising 174% rate of return. So they can be incredibly profitable. But you hit on the bigger issue, which is it sustainable? Yeah. And what we found are these little companies are just not sustainable. When you're taking out 30% of the premium dollar, some of that, I would say maybe in many cases, most of that 30% of the premium dollar is not going to any real services. It's going to profits. And there since they passed all this litigation reform in the last sessions, you're starting to see Republican lawmakers start to panic, realizing that it didn't work, or it hasn't worked yet, and it probably won't work in the long run. And so they're talking about different ideas. And I wrote about an idea that last year about that the people came up during the last insurance crisis. Most people forget that there was this exact same story, the same story played out in between 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, where you had a major insurance crisis, you had companies going under. Guess what? Also, you saw companies going out of business because they were stripping money out of the companies. But in any case, there was an idea floated then that Republicans took seriously, and State Farm and Allstate, all the big insurance companies were in favor of this. And the idea was, instead of paying your windstorm premium to a company, you would pay your windstorm premium to the state. The state would collect all the windstorm premiums. So basically 100% of it is basically owned by the citizens of Florida or homeowners. Okay. And that pool of money would be available to pay out after storm claims. And, basically instead of stripping profits out of the premium dollar, you just take it to the state. And you would still deal with your insurance company. They would be the ones handling your claim, your homeowner's claim and whatnot. But people agreed at the time that the math worked. And it's not an unprecedented model. California does this for hurricane insurance. Texas also has the Texas Windstorm Association, which operates kind of the same way. And Texas is not really done well with the Windstorm Association, I hear, but it's a model where basically the math works. And by now, this pool of money would have been more than $100 billion if they'd enacted it back in 2010. But even though Allstate and State Farm are on board with this, because they don't want the risk of the reason why Allstate, State Farm, the big boys are not here in the state to the extent they should be, because they don't want to take on the risk from windstorm.
Right.
Yeah.
They can insure fire and theft all day long, because that's what the rest of the country doesn't have windstorm premiums like we do. Texas, Oklahoma, states like that do, but most states don't. They just have fire and theft. State Farm and Allstate are fine with that, but it came down to politics is what killed it. Basically, the domestic insurance companies, the 80% that dominate the market here, they killed it. They lobbied it and said, this is basically going to kill our profits. They can't compete with Allstate and State Farm on fire and theft coverage, which basically is what they would do. They'd still make some money, but they wouldn't be nearly as profitable. And you're starting to see, I expect a bill on this topic to be filed this coming session to at least look at this. But there's ideas out there that the math works. Whether they're politically viable is a totally different issue. But I feel like there are solutions. But the theme of that story that I had last week was basically that the state hasn't studied it. The state's done no studies, basically none, on this entire topic.
How is that
possible? Which says a lot, right?
How is that possible?
They don't hold hearings. They don't do studies.
This is starting to feel a lot to me the way that it felt about, I think it was like 12 or 13 years ago, when there started to be a lot of manipulation and capping of information that was even collectible about guns. It reminds me of that. I don't know if you all remember that, but there was a point where gun data looked so bad for one particular political side of the aisle that the solution was, well, let's make it illegal to collect that data and like make sure that nobody finds that out. And you brought up the Texas windstorms, and I'm glad you did, because that reminded me in your story that when they tried to do an apples to apples comparison, you can explain this better than I can, obviously, but there was huge missing gaps of what other states are reporting, what types of disasters were being reported, and huge sets of consumer data that didn't appear, and made it very difficult to figure any of this out, right?
Yeah, that's the issue, is that, as I quoted Senator Pizzo in that story, telling the insurance commissioner, like, we get more information on UFOs in the last year than we've gotten on Florida's insurance market. We can't, seriously, we don't even know the most basic information. What's the average premium paid in Florida? The Office of Insurance Regulation doesn't release that. That comes from a third party insurance information institute. We don't even know, how much did premiums go up on average?
But Lawrence, how is that?
I mean, there's a lot of,
Is it on purpose? Are they trying to hide the data? Is it just negligence? How is this possible?
It's a combination of all these things. It's basically incompetence, and you have a state legislature it's lost. If you look at the last insurance crisis, there were all kinds. I mean, it was, again, Republicans were in control. They controlled both chambers and the governor's office, and there was a lot more curiosity. There was a lot more holding insurance. They held hearings. I mean, I've got a binder somewhere here of work product from the insurance committees back in 2010, 2011. And it's a binder like this thick of materials describing the history of the insurance crisis, the motivating factors. None of that exists this time. Yeah. None of it exists. Nobody's done any work at all on this. And the one thing that they have done, the legislators did do, is they started requiring in 2021 for insurance companies to start reporting more information on their litigation to the state. Sounds perfectly reasonable if they're crying about how litigation is the problem. Well,
they want to be able to, support that.
When the deadline came, 71% of the companies submitted no data, literally nothing. They submitted a zero. And another 18% were late on it. So we still don't have any release of this information.
So when they gave these $3 trillion, right? That was incorrect. $3 trillion that we were just talking about. They basically called billion. Billion. That's too much. Right? Yeah. They called these two special sessions, gave these $3 billion. They did this without any of the research, any of the studies, that you would, need in hand to do this. They just basically were like, let's build a plane as we're flying it, folks.
Let me give you another example. We mentioned the Tasha Carter survey. Tasha Carter, I'd never heard of this survey until I started reporting for this last story. I'd never heard of this data, and I've been desperate for any kind of data. This is an industry that thrives on data. It exists because of data, insurance. It's all based on projections and modeling and all this kind of stuff. And yet there's none of it. Tasha Carter gave us a presentation in 2021 to a House committee where she briefly mentioned this survey, but she never gave the survey in the Senate. Lobbyists I spoke to, lawmakers I talked to, they'd never seen this. A survey of 7,000 people who'd hired a lawyer? That is really, really good information to have if you're going to be deciding whether or not to make it much, much harder and more expensive to sue your insurance company, right? But you see that this is a repeat. I'm reading a book right now about the medical malpractice crisis. There's been 3 medical malpractice crises since the 70s. where it's the same exact arguments. It's always trial lawyers versus insurance companies. The trial lawyers say, "Oh, we're policing the industry," and the insurance companies say, "Oh, you're driving up rates and driving away doctors," or whatever. Well, the Cato Institute came out with this huge. I mean, not a liberal bastion of
Gerald's employer.
Yep. Yeah. Again, Koch brothers founded, right? But they came out with a huge study, a really good book about examining the medical malpractice crises, and found that the insurance companies' claims were all bogus. There wasn't any evidence for them. None. They also concluded that the trial lawyers did a terrible job of actually policing the industry too. But when we're talking about like these claims and the fact there's no data to back it up, beyond the fact that there's a lot of lawsuits, I mean, that's a problem. That's a problem. They haven't studied this.
I mean, just to try to thread the needle on, you brought up earlier the rate of profit, the executive pay. I think in your article there was an executive making twice as much as the CEO of State Farm. The tension that creates with the price of insurance. It seems like what is unsustainable is the rate of profitability. If everything that you're saying about the small affiliate firms is true, to the point where now people are we worry about, oh, well, if we make it unhospitable to companies, the companies will leave. Well, if you make it unhospitable to insurance payers, the insurance payers are going to exit the state because they won't be able to afford to live in Florida anymore.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And yeah, it's staggering. In between 2005 and 2017, there were no storms, no hurricanes, no named hurricanes. And this was an era of incredible profitability for these little.
They were raking it in.
It was basically a license to burn money. You mentioned this little domestic insurance company in Florida was the CEO was making more than twice the CEO of State Farm, despite having like 0.01% the number of policies as State Farm or whatever it was. It was a ridiculously tiny number, but that wasn't unusual. I mean, a lot of these domestic companies have, relatives on the payroll getting stuff. They pay a lot in dividends. And when these forensic accountants have gone in and turned over the books, when these companies fail, they repeatedly find these inappropriate transactions between the affiliate companies and the insurance company, where, like in one case, the auditors wrote that the executives were, quote unquote, stripping the company of cash as it was going down. I mean, others were paying dividends, regardless of if the company was profitable. There's basically been no scrutiny on this industry for the last 15 years, pretty much. And now we're maybe starting to wake up to that a little bit.
To try to put it like a bow on it, they say that the crisis is due to litigation, even though there's no proof. So they put a cap on litigation. But it's very possible that the crisis is due to the cash stripping by these affiliate companies, and we actually don't know very much about that at all. Yeah.
Don't you finish that thought, Gerald? Don't you dare finish that thought.
No, and the legislature, just to tie up, the legislature actually tried to take a look at these affiliate finances, the finances of these companies in the last special session, or actually in this past session in April. And they decided not to do it. It was in the bill. They had it in the bill to look at this stuff, and they stripped it out because the bill sponsor told me they didn't want to upset the apple cart of the industry, because this is the cash cow of the industry. This is how you lure investors. How they, is this weird structure.
And of course, all of this happens as. The context that we have to mention is that a small tropical storm overnight turned into a Category 5 hurricane and devastated Acapulco, a city, not on the global scale, not that far away from us. We're ending up this hurricane season with a look at, what could be in store for the future. And it's scary to think that this is the safety net that we have. But I want to thank our guest, Lawrence Maurer, who's a reporter, again, covering the Capitol for the Tampa Bay Times, Miami Herald, Tallahassee. You should follow him on Twitter. He is at LMaurer3. Lawrence, thanks for coming on and talking about this with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.